All right, hello again, everyone. Today we will be covering a new lesson. So let's just begin. First of all, actually, I'd like to begin by talking about one of my favorite linguists and second language scientist, Stephen Krashen. So remember, class, one of our keys, really, while we are speaking, is to be patient with ourselves. It's a long process. We have to be patient. Also with our classmates and our professor. Remember also, don't be too hard on yourself. So that's what I mean by don't try to be perfect. It's okay if you're not perfect in the beginning. It's a process to learn. Especially while we're speaking. It's normal to make mistakes. In fact, it's a good sign to make mistakes. And the third rule, circumlocution, we'll talk about later, but this is basically our ability to quickly navigate around and call upon other ways to describe things if we can't remember the exact vocabulary in that moment. All right, that was just a little review. I always like to keep everyone comfortable in the class, and so this is why I like to review Krashen and my own modified rules for speaking. Right? This does not pertain to writing, reading, or listening. All right. So now let's take a look at the day of the week. It's Monday. Here we have the date, April 1st, 2019. And these are going to be our topics for today. So we're going to cover quite a few interesting topics. The present simple, as basic as it is, can actually be a source of a little bit of confusion, especially for my Romance language students, right? So for example, I know this makes up a large percentage of our ESL community, so I'll just make a small example. It would be very common in Spanish to say, apago la luz, I turn off the lights, meaning I will do this now. And in English, we don't do this. And we'll see really the situations we do use the present simple in today. And then we will also look at affirmative and negative examples, okay? And then after that, we'll look at time expressions, keeping in mind that time expressions are, we can apply some general rules, but this is really one of those categories that we'll kind of continuously add more and more expressions, because it's a big category, but we'll begin to introduce some of the more common ones and talk about why, how we can categorize these time expressions in some ways, okay? So later, we're also going to talk about the rules for adding S, or ES, or IES, as in plurals, right, in English. So there's a few tricky little things to keep in mind. So we're going to cover a lot today, but another thing will be adverbs of frequency. Again, we're just going to jump into some of the most common. We won't cover necessarily all of them, but these are our main points for today, all right? And, okay, so with that in mind, let's jump right ahead. The first thing I would like to do with you all today is a game, okay? And I have taken the liberty to write on a large piece of paper 3 facts, okay? Or shall we say facts. This game is called 2 Truths, 1 Lie, right? So truths and lies, these are opposites. So what I'll do is I'll read to you these 3 sentences I've created, and then after I'm done, you'll guess which one wasn't true, okay? So the first one is, I speak 4 languages. All right, the next one is, I have a sister who lives in Savannah. And the third one is, I eat tacos on Tuesday every week. All right, so which do we think it is? You may have guessed. The first one is not true. Okay, so I do speak 2 languages. I'm working on a third, but I don't speak 4, that's for sure. So the rest are true. And what we'll do now, guys, is I want to pass out these large papers, okay? And in pairs, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same idea. We're going to write down, you will write down two truths and one lie, okay? And your partner will guess which one was the lie, okay? And we'll see who can correctly know their fellow students better. This is a way we'll get to know each other better also, sort of team building activity, okay? And once you are finished with this, I'll give you a few minutes to create your two truths and one lie, and then I'll give you a few minutes to also guess which ones were true. After that, what we're going to do is you're going to mix around the classroom, and you're not going to exactly repeat the same activity. What you're going to do is you're going to tell someone new what your previous partner told you, okay? So I'll show you an example. Here we have, again, these same sentences, essentially, but instead of in first person, we put this in third person, right? So Mark says. Now, you may have noticed I've underlined the S, and some words have changed, right? So we're going to look at this later. We're going to look at the rules about why this happens. But first, after you're done completing the first step of the two truths, one lie, you're going to try to repeat this. However, before we jump into that, I'm going to help you because changing from these different positions is not easy, right? From first person to third person. So now, let's go ahead and begin with the two truths, one lie. And as soon as you're done, we'll jump over here, okay? All right, so I will assume you have already finished. So now, what I want us to look at now are affirmative and negative constructions in the present tense, okay? So, once again, class, I, you, we, they, what do we call these words? Or also he, she, or it? That is the subject. And in English, except in passive forms, nearly always the subject goes first and then the verb. Okay, so in the affirmative present simple, it's simply an I, you, we, they, and then the verb. Okay. Later, we have a tiny change here, and that's why I wanted to teach you this before we continue. In these structures, he, she, or it, you maintain the same form, but the verb will get an S. Okay. Now let's look at the negative. Very similar, right? The subject first, but then we say don't, and then the verb. And maintaining a similarity with this, but there's a small difference. We have he, she, or it, and then it's doesn't plus the verb. Okay? Got this? One more thing to point out, a small difference. Okay, the example I gave earlier of our Romance language friends, our French speakers, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian. One thing we know is, I gave the example of apagar a luz, which is I turn off the lights, right? This would be normal to say, as in I will turn off the lights, I'm going to turn off the lights, but not in English, right? In English, we use the present simple only for facts. For example, at 0 degrees, water freezes in Celsius. General truths, or routines or daily habits, right? I wake up and drink coffee every day. Or like the example we have here. Let's see. I eat tacos on Tuesday every week, okay? Now, just one more thing to be said about this, and that's that we have a few pesky irregulars. By the way, as who was it? Steven Pinker told us, he did an exhaustive verb study, and unfortunately, as it turns out, most of the irregular verbs tend to be the most used verbs in most languages, in fact, not just the English language, but definitely the English language. And that seems to be because they've maintained their form, they haven't basically had as much time to change their form. Anyways, what this means is new verbs don't tend to be in irregular forms, but words like be, and by the way, new verbs meaning often you see in categories that are growing quickly, like technology, lots of new verbs popping up, new words. But this is clearly one of the most basic verbs possible, right? To be. So how are we going to make these? Well, it's I am, you are, he, she, or it is. Very unusual. Let's see. We are also. Oops, there we go. Are and they are. Okay, in the present simple. Now we also have have. So I have. You have. Right. And here it gets a little. Oops, here it gets a little tricky. I got ahead of myself. He, she, or it has. Exactly. Okay, and then they have and we have. Sorry, I'm jumping around the order a bit. All right, so there we have just a couple of irregulars we need to keep in mind. So we should now be able to construct some more sentences, and just for clarity's sake, I went ahead and took our student Alvaro's example. And Alvaro reportedly has said, and here I've underlined also some of these examples, right, to try to clarify this. Alvaro doesn't, and you see the like doesn't need an S because doesn't in the negative form, as we saw, doesn't takes the S, does takes the S, or doesn't takes the S. Like tacos. Alvaro usually, okay, this is a time, what do we call it? Adverb of frequency that we'll see later. But here we see in the third person watches it with the S, right? TV at night. And Alvaro goes, again, third person in the S, to dance lesson on Saturday. Okay, cool. Moving right along. All right, okay, so what we'll do now also is to do a soft evaluation, confirm that we have understood. I'm going to pass out these papers, and we'll just take a couple of minutes to go over them. It's just review for present simple, okay? And in pairs, we can also, I'll walk around, I'll float around, I'll help you all if you have doubts. And in pairs, we're going to help each other and sort of self-correct. It's just reinforcing what we're learning, really. Okay? All right. So, now that you're finished with that section, I know I'm going fast, excuse me. And actually, I'm going to do one technical thing here. I'm going to rotate the camera. Okay, great. So here's the next part we're going to learn. And I'm going to try to explain plurals to you all now, okay? So, in English, well, actually a little tiny history lesson. I don't want to confuse things, but I love these sort of linguistic facts. The Vikings actually brought to us the norm of having S as a plural, right? Before that, almost all nouns were like teeth or feet, meaning they had an irregular plural formation. But to simplify things, when the Vikings came over and started dominating the English islands, they had the S rule. So that's the most basic rule. In English, like in some other languages, we add S to anything, right? To any object to make it plural. To a noun. So for our example today is papers. Okay? Later we have an unusual ES formation, and that simply follows if the word ends in SH, CH, X, O, or SS. For example, boxes. Right? Boxes is an example of an irregular plural. Or you can say peaches. And peaches are one of my favorite fruits in the summer. Okay? So, there's just one more odd form, that's the IES form. When do we do the IES form? Okay, so that is when a word ends in Y, okay? So I went ahead and wrote down just in very tiny letters, I'll make this bigger. If we have the word baby, well, how do you say plurals for babies? Is it S like this? No, it's not. We have the Y here, and before the Y, the letter preceding the Y is a consonant. So that means we have to take away these two and make it an IES. However, if you have a word like lay, and it's not a noun, it's a verb, but it still follows the same rules. If we have a word like lay, because there is a vowel and before the Y, that's just going to maintain its form. Boop, that's it. All right. There we have it. We're moving very quickly. What I want us to do now is on the back. Oh, well, okay. Maybe not on the back, but I'll pass out some more large white papers. Okay. And what I want us to do is what's called a think, pair, square, share activity. Okay. So I want you all to take just 2 to 3 minutes to brainstorm as many plurals as possible, okay? So this one's going to be pretty easy. We might find this to be a bit more challenging, and this might also be hard, but we just have to remember the rule. If the vowel is before the Y, it just stays normal. If there's a consonant, we have to take off the Y and add the IES. So individually, 2 or 3 minutes, brainstorm as many plurals as possible in any of these forms. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I'll say stop, and I'll say, okay, in pairs, let's get together. We'll take another 2 minutes, and in pairs, you guys can share and see what you found, what was different, what was similar. After 2 or 3 minutes of this, I'll say, okay, stop. We'll square, which means 2 pairs will get together. 4, and you all can share together everything you found and what was different, what was similar. The last thing will be to share. So the whole class will share. Each group will share what they have, and in this way we're combining all of our knowledge. Okay. And let's jump ahead now. I apologize if I'm going a little fast. I'm sorry. I just want to be as efficient as possible with time. Okay, so now, what we're going to look at now are time expressions. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are many time expressions. We're not going to cover all of them today, but we'll look at a few, and we'll look at some of their general, shall we say, categories, or when we use them. So, for example, here we have every. And this is, we can think of it in segments, if that helps. So we tend to say things like every day, every month, every year, etc. Yeah? Which is not to say there aren't exceptions, but this is one way to help us remember the rules. So what we have later is on, right? But with on, we often use this. Also, as a side note, some of these are not the same in British English, which you may be more schooled in, depending upon where you come from. But that's okay. We're just learning general rules of thumb, okay? So on, we typically, in American English, say with days or dates. On the 15th of April, okay? So also, guys, perhaps I'm covering too many materials here. These are called cardinal numbers. We tend to use them like I did with the date earlier, but that's for another class. Actually, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Here we have a date. So on with days or dates. On Monday would be another example. Okay. So at. Again, we're generalizing, but at often goes with precise times or moments. At 5 o'clock, I'll be I'll be in the gym. Or, you know what? We can even say at again, at the gym. All right. Last but not least, we have in. Now, what I've put here are long periods, but again, I'm having to stress this because there are many exceptions. So, what we have though is in, when we think about it in long periods, in 4 years, I'll have learned English. Excuse me for sort of putting my stuff together here. I'm going in a hurry. Okay, in 4 years I'll have learned English. We also have an unusual form here, which we'll be able to look at more in the future perfect tense. But again, we can't learn it all in one day, which is also part of the reason we like to remember Krashen's rules about patience, for example. Okay, now, moving right along. We are going to look at, oops, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'd like to do now is reinforce what we're learning. And so, if you'll take just a few moments, you can write on the back of these papers I gave you earlier, right? If you don't have your own paper, especially, this could be useful. We're going to try to make some simple present tense sentences, okay? And let's use plurals, and let's use our time expressions, okay? And I'm going to be floating around the class as usual. And we're just trying to put into practice what we're learning. So, keeping in mind, present simple. Generally, we're talking about facts, general truths, and routines. Okay? So, floating around the class, this is going to be our, we'll just take a few minutes to practice making a few sentences. Let's say maybe 4 or 5. Okay? Trying to incorporate plurals and our time expressions in present simple sentences. All right? So, last but not least, by any means, we have adjectives of frequency. So, much like our time expressions, not quite to the same extent, but there are more adverbs of frequency than we will cover today. But we're going to look at a few, and I'm going to pass out this worksheet, okay? And it will help us with a few examples. But first, before we begin with this worksheet, let's talk about our sort of pyramid of, inverted pyramid of how often, or what these adverbs of frequency imply. Okay? So, first of all, perhaps it's easier to start at the extremes, right? So we know always, and it is always, 100%, right? And never is the opposite, 0%, right? And then we have sort of the meat in the sandwich, right? Everything in between. We have rarely, or hardly ever. That indicates it's not common at all. We have sometimes. This sort of gives like a 50-50 chance, right, of the frequency. We have often. Okay. And we have usually, and you know, there's some room for, these are not exact percentages, but in general, our inverted pyramid goes something like this, right? Referring to how often something is done, right? So we can practice making sentences with these adverbs of frequency. And that's really going to conclude the class for today. So before we wrap it up completely, I just want to remind everyone that You can always go to either my platform page, so or my email, or my Flipped Classroom YouTube page, because I know that we go fast. Some learn more quickly, some learn more slowly. Perhaps we didn't understand a part. It's no problem. The good news is, with the Flipped Classroom sort of stylized approach, we can review videos. I will have links there of all of these grammatical lessons, okay? So anyone, as long as you have a phone, computer, tablet, or access to a library, you can go to my YouTube page, or my email address, or my platform, and there you'll find links, okay, explaining these again. They're very short videos too. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed it, okay?